We're continuing with this theme of lessons on the United Kingdom, the United Monarchy. And so you only have 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. And as it turns out, they all each reigned for 40 years. So go ahead and enjoy that part, that fact, because afterwards it's not that simple. You know, you've got a lot of variation, but we're not there yet. We're here talking tonight about Solomon. We've had lessons on Saul and his downward spiral, the disquietude that was caused by sin. We've seen where sin takes you when it's unchecked. And we saw the importance of being, as Jonathan was to David, one who would strengthen his hand in the Lord. That's what we need the most, and that's what we can do with each other. And so when David was in a time of crisis, he strengthened himself in the Lord, but Jonathan, his friend, contributed to that. We saw this morning the centrality of the Davidic covenant, that the covenant that God made with David is a continuation of his covenant, developing that covenant that was made from the time of creation in Genesis 3:15, or I should say following creation in the Garden of Eden at that point, going back to Eden. And so we looked at fast forwarding to the New Testament after laying the foundation and seeing how important that was in the Old Covenant time. We saw how that the New Testament takes right up and shows that what Jesus did was to give us the sure mercies of David that Isaiah 55 and verse 5 foretold, and as Paul explained in Acts 13 at Antioch of Pisidia. But tonight we continue as we look now at Solomon. And I want tonight, as well as the next Lord's Day morning, to have lessons pertaining to that third and final king of the United Kingdom. The first thing I want to do is not the passage we're going to spend more of our time with. We're going to spend more of our time in 1 Kings 11. But there's a passage before that that's important, and so we'll look at that one first. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 5. 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 5 is our starting point, because just as we have emphasized that God chose Saul to be king, we saw that last Sunday morning, and God then chose David to be king, we might assume, well, he chose Solomon as well. But you know, we don't like to assume things when we go to scriptures that plainly point out the information that we don't want to just be vague about that. But in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 5, David is speaking. He's speaking in an assembly, and this is in David's old age, not too long before his death, and when that transition of power from David to Solomon is about to take place. And so there's some things of importance that he wants to say to the house of Israel, to the people of the nation in the assembly. And here's what the verse I want to look at is 1 Chronicles 28, verse 5, where David says, "And of all my sons, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel." And I say that as our starting point because we can gather, as we look at the information in Kings, that certainly David wanted Solomon to be the next king. And certainly Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, wanted him to be the next king. But here's a passage that says it's more than that. That the Lord, he has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. Now let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11 is going to tell us of Solomon's apostasy. And I'm going to backtrack in just a moment. But what you have here is that God chose him to be king, and yet we read in 1 Kings chapter 11 that of the nations in verse 2, of which the Lord has said, "You shall not intermarry with them," Solomon clung to these in love. The warning was, "Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. In fact, he had 700 wives, princesses, 300 concubines. His wives turned away his heart. And in verse 4, Again, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And verse 5 explains his heart went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not fully follow the Lord as did his father David. He even in verse 7 built a high place for Chemosh on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. I might say in the passing you can still see that today. And the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 23 and verse 13 calls it the Mount of Corruption. But that location can still be seen today. So it's going to be because of this that in verse 11 the Lord will say to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Okay, it's a place to ask the question, what happens between that point where God chose Solomon to be king and 1 Kings chapter 11 that describes such a terrible outcome, a terrible ending, and that's why I said I want us to backtrack and make a few observations of what's going on. The first thing is, not only did God, let's turn to 1 Kings 3, and we'll just be in 1 Kings here for a little bit. But not only did God choose him to be king, if we're not careful, we'll think, well, you know, back in Bible times, God just appeared to people all the time and spoke to them all the time. It was a pretty regular thing. That is not true. There are periods where there was a lot of revelation to certain ones. But as far as this just being a regular thing, I mean, how many times do you read where God directly spoke to King Saul? I mean, you can go through how many direct conversations where God is appearing to someone, and it ends up not being a lot. And I say that because in 1 Kings chapter 3, it's a very special thing. When in 1 Kings chapter 3, here Solomon has gone to the altar to sacrifice. At this time, the altar's in Gibeon in verse 4, which is very close to Jerusalem. In verse 5, 1 Kings 3:5, the Lord appeared to him in a dream by night and said, God said, what? He said, ask, what shall I give you? Now it's not like everybody has this opportunity. This is special. God has made a personal appearance. Solomon, what shall I give you? Solomon said, you've shown great mercy to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You've continued this great kindness for him, and you've given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you've chosen, a great multitude, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Isn't that a good start? I mean, theoretically, he could have asked for anything. He says, I feel so inadequate for this task at hand. I feel such a need for wisdom from you. Please grant unto me wisdom that I might know how to rule. And the text says in the 10th verse that the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon asked for him. And Solomon says, because you've asked for this, you've not asked for riches, you've not asked for longevity, I'm going to give you what you asked for, and I'll give you more. He said, the understanding in verse 12, I've given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And besides that, he promises him riches. Now, this doesn't mean Solomon was to seek riches. You know, there's a difference in someone that loves money and he's all about money and that's his priority, and someone that money happens to. You know what I'm saying? Where you're going about your work, your business, you're pleasing God, and you prosper. And so God is saying he's going to prosper him. That's different than a direct pursuit of money. I mentioned that in the passing. But at any rate, I always like to call attention when there is a conditional statement. We have trained eyes. We look for promises, but sometimes, like in verse 4, do you see a little word there in verse 4? So if you walk in my ways, you see that word if. And so that's stating a condition that God is giving him great opportunities, a great resource of wisdom. He's promising wealth. But it's if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Well, Solomon awoke. Let me just mention in the passing that this is one of 2 times that God appeared to Solomon. This is at the beginning of his reign. He reigned for 40 years, but at the midpoint of his reign, I'm fast forwarding to 1 Kings 9. In 1 Kings chapter 9, after he has built the temple and after he's built the palace, and so this would be just beyond really the midpoint of his reign, there's a second time. When Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all Solomon's desire, verse 2 says, the Lord appeared to Solomon, this is 1 Kings 9 verse 2, a second time at Gibeon. I've heard your prayer, your supplication. Now what he's talking about is in chapter 8, when the temple was dedicated, Solomon was on his knees before all the people praying. That's the gist of 1 Kings 8. God says, I've heard your prayer, your supplication that you have made before me. I've sanctified this house which you built to put my name there forever, and my eyes and heart will be there perpetually. But what do you see in verse 4? Do you see it with me? I'm reading the New King James, but it says, now if, there's that word if again. If you walk before me, then verse 5, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom forever. But if you cease from following me, then the punishment, verse 6 and following, will come. I'm just saying, number 1, God chose him to be king. And number 2, God made 2 very special personal appearances to him. And this request for wisdom, God granted him wisdom. And God granted riches, even though Solomon did not request wealth. But we look back to 1 Kings chapter 4, which kind of gives an overview of Solomon's kingdom. And these are sometimes what I call summary statements. His reign, geographically, in 1 Kings chapter 4, he reigned over all kingdoms from the river, that's the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. The border of Egypt was not the Nile River. It's a brook known as the Wadi El Arish. And so from the Euphrates all the way to the brook of Israel, the brook of Egypt really, he's ruling over all that. That doesn't mean Israel occupied all that. That means Israel controlled all of that. That's his dominion in verse 24 as that word is used there. And the peace, verse 25, for Israel and Judah from Dan to Beersheba. Each one is under his own vine and fig tree. But I'm talking about his wisdom now in verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and exceeding great understanding and largeness of heart like sand on the seashore. Now, usually that expression, like sand on the seashore, God will say, look at the stars. Can you count them? Look at the sand on the sea. Can you count the sand on the seashore? So shall your descendants be. So it's counting people, a numerous people, like sand on the seashore. But here it's not talking about counting people. It's talking about some way to measure his wisdom. And the verse is saying he has exceeding great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. You just can't count it. It's so large you cannot really form an accurate estimate. And others in verse 31 that were noted as wise men, he was wiser than those. And not only that, but God used him to author a lot of things. In verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs. Now, in the book of Proverbs, there are 1,000 of Solomon's proverbs that are recorded. But he wrote 3,000 proverbs. And his songs were 1,005. Now we have 3 of his songs. One is the Song of Solomon. The other 2 are Psalms. Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. But he wrote 1,005 songs. So a prolific author, including the scriptural writing. But his knowledge was so varied. It wasn't just about, you might say, spiritual matters. But in verse 33, he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds. I mean, he's a botanist, zoologist. He's an expert in all of these things. And verse 34, and men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Now here's what happens. That's the general statement. And then there's one specific example that we have. You know who I'm talking about. A few chapters later in 1 Kings 10, that's where the queen of Sheba will come to hear the wisdom of Solomon. The queen of Sheba. And do you remember in Matthew the 12th chapter that Jesus would say that the people of this generation shall rise up in the judgment? That is, the people of the Old Testament will rise up against this generation because, for example, the queen of Sheba, he says, travel from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And Jesus said, behold, a greater than Solomon is here. Well, that's quite a statement for Jesus to say he's greater than Solomon. But my point is, the queen of Sheba traveled from the ends of the earth. And when you take your map and you look at Israel, and you have a map that goes far enough down, you keep going down, and it's the Arabian Peninsula for 1,000 miles, and then you see Sheba, and then after that you're in the Arabian Ocean. You just drop right off. And she came literally from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But so first Kings 10 describes that. What I'm saying is in chapter 4, that shows us that she's just one among many. It says all the kings of the earth came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. She was just one that did that. We know more about her because it records those details. But what she did, a lot of kings did. A lot of kings did, as chapter 4 there continues. This is wisdom. This is knowledge. He was sought after. He had great privileges. And as I mentioned a while ago, think about building the temple. You know, for all that time prior to that, Joshua chapter 18 and verse 1, the tabernacle during the days of the conquest was set up at Shiloh. And it would serve there, the people of God, until it was destroyed in the days of Samuel and Eli by the Philistines. And then it's neglected in the days of Saul. David wanted to build the house of the Lord. We mentioned that this morning in 2 Samuel 7. But God said, no, David can't. But he let Solomon. He authorized Solomon to build the temple. And that would be the house of the Lord where God would cause his name to dwell. How special is that? And Solomon was given the opportunity and the privilege of building the temple of the Lord there in Jerusalem. And you see him when it is dedicated. I just want to read one verse there in 1 Kings chapter 8. That it talks about his prayer, verse 22 and following, coming on down. And then verse 54, when Solomon had finished praying all this prayer. So all that's his prayer. But it says he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread up to heaven. I mean, to me, that is very touching. Here's this powerful king. Everybody's coming to hear him, but he talks about how great God is. And in that prayer, we learn it here at the conclusion when he gets up. But he's on his knees, and all the people see their king on his knees with his hands lifted up to God for this prayer. All I'm saying is when we start from the time he's on the throne, and we start with that first appearance in 1 Kings chapter 3, and it's just chapter after chapter, blessing after blessing, and wonderful things he's receiving, wonderful things he's doing. And then as we started out with the reading, yet we read, his heart turned away. I'm just asking the question tonight, what do you suppose went on in his mind? How do you account for that? How do you account for the fact that the wisest man on earth basically falls flat on his face? How is this possible? And I wonder if it's going to be something that is real complicated for us to try to unravel this and see what happened. You know, a lot of times we can make things too complicated, can't we? Now, I don't mean that we should make something simplistic, but sometimes it's not that complicated. Turn with me, let's look at a couple of verses. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, this is winding up the 40 years wandering. This is Moses speaking to the people just before Joshua would lead them after Moses' death on in to conquer the land. But basically in Deuteronomy, it's not so much giving new laws to this new generation, it's the second numbering, but it's reminding them, listen, when you cross the land, God's going to give you the good land. But if you get over there and forget your covenant, it won't go well with you. It'll be terrible. And so among the things Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 7, when the Lord your God brings you to the land which you go to possess and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them, utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Verse 3, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter for your son. They will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. And so God is saying, listen, in verse 8, you come across their places of worship, destroy their altars, break down their sacred pillars, cut down their wooden images, burn their carved images with fire. You don't keep that for some souvenir and stick it up in your house for an ornament. You burn it with fire. You destroy it. Have nothing to do with it. Not only that, that was for all of Israel. But you turn a few chapters further in Deuteronomy chapter 17, and you see something here that is especially and specifically given to and about the kings. They don't have a king yet. But Deuteronomy 17 anticipates the time in verse 14, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. This is for Deuteronomy 17 verse 15. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. Well, we started out tonight, God chose Solomon. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You shall not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself. I didn't call attention to that a while ago. That's one of the things Solomon did. Nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. He got the horses from Egypt. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Now verse 17, neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Did you notice in 1 Kings 11? A total of 1,000 wives, concubines and wives. The concubines are wives too. Secondary status. But he sure multiplied wives, didn't he? Lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. But here's what I'm leading up to. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Don't you find that fascinating? Here, he's not only to have a copy of the law, he is in his own hand to write a copy of the law. Have any of you ever done that? I mean, I raise that question just because sometimes people do that. They'll maybe take a book in the Bible. I think that I've heard Tom Holly, as he's so much taught the Gospel of Luke, he'll talk about someone just taking the book of Luke and in their own handwriting with pen and paper, just starting in chapter 1 and make their own copy. Just write it. And how much that does for you to just write out the text and have your own copy that you have written. That's what the king was to do. You see, I mean, for the sake of argument, one of those Levites that was a scribe, they could have made a copy. Here, give me a copy. I mean, you keep reading about the history, and it talks about recorders, it talks about the staff of the kings, and they had people writing in Chronicles and recording in the annals of the kings things that were happening. And so one of them could have just made him a copy. Here. No. He's to take that writing instrument. He is to write his own copy. And all the days that he sits on the throne, it's there with him. And all the days of his life. And not only does he have a copy, verse 19 says, and he shall read it all the days of his life. He's written it out in his own hand. He has it with him as he's on the throne, and he reads it all the days of his life. Why? Verse 19, that he learns to fear the Lord his God. Observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up. We don't have to go to some psychoanalyst to see what went wrong. These are simple, basic things. Don't marry these pagan women. Don't involve yourself in anything that has to do with their worship. You keep a copy of God's law that you've written out in your own hand. You sit on the throne, you read that, and you rule based on what God has said. You're a king, but you're not above the law. You read these statutes. You fear the Lord, lest your heart be lifted up. Now, the thing is, there's not a passage, with all this information. And then we come to 1 Kings 11 and we're asking what happened. How did he get derailed? There's not a passage that says this one specific thing is what did it. But all we have to do is see what God said and see what he did. And probably an attitude first. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23, verse 7. So some thinking is going on. Here again, I'm not pretending to know his thoughts. God knows the thoughts of all. But it could have been something like this. Those laws are necessary for most people. Those laws are necessary for the common Israelites. But after all, I've reached a degree of spiritual maturity. The Lord has appeared to me twice. And look at the wisdom. People come from everywhere to hear my wisdom. So I am so wise. I have so much wisdom that some of these things that God has prohibited, I can do that, but it won't affect me because I'm so strong. I'm so mature. It may have been that kind of reasoning, that his heart was lifted up. And it may be what he thought would be a problem for other people would be no problem for him. I can handle any situation that arises. And what we find is that the wisest man on earth, when he failed to keep these basic fundamental requirements of God's law, went into apostasy and was condemned by the Lord for that. I call this sometimes the fallacy of thinking of oneself as a super Christian. I know this is the Old Testament. I know that disciples were not Christians until that time in Acts 11 at Antioch. So consider this a prototype. But what Solomon went through with this is not unlike what you have in other cases. You remember Peter, when the Lord tried to appeal to him and said, Satan, he says, Simon, Satan has desired, he's asked for you that he might sift you as wheat. But do thou when you have returned, strengthen your brethren. You remember what Peter said? Though all deny you, I will not deny you. I'm ready to go to prison with you. And Jesus is saying, before the night passes, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. That'll never happen. I'm ready to go to death and go to prison with you. What was Peter thinking? I was one of 3 people that saw him raise Jairus' daughter. I was one of 3 people that was with him at the Mount of Transfiguration. The Lord and I have a very special relationship, a very special friendship. And so some of these other disciples, they may need that warning, but I don't need that warning. And you know what happened to Peter? Jesus again, before that happened, said, watch and pray. But the 3 disciples slept while my loving Savior wept at Gethsemane alone. And Peter found out that he was not a super Christian. Peter found out that he, like everybody else, needed the warnings of the Lord. Think in terms about the Corinthians. What is Paul writing to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 8? He's writing to people that said, you know, I can go right into an idol's temple and I can sit right down and I can eat because I know that an idol is nothing in the world. Well, what about, there are a lot of considerations. What about a brother that you might lead astray? Well, those spiritual weaklings, but now I'm so strong, it won't impact me. And you know what Paul will tell the Corinthians that were so smug and they were so super Christians? In verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 8, he says, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. In verse 2, he says, you know nothing as you ought to know. And in verse 11, he asks, what about the brother that's destroyed by your knowledge? And so he's going to say in chapter 10 and verse 12, wherefore let him that thinks he stand take heed lest he fall. You see, what happened to Solomon is full of application to us. Someone may bring a lesson. I remember Bob Waldron, I've shared this with you before, but when I was still a young man and unmarried and studying diligently with Bob, and he and I were doing a lot of things together, but not always together, and he said, Leon, as you reach out and as you visit people, you're going to go to a house sometime and you'll find that the woman is there alone. And he said, do not under any circumstances go into the house with just you and her alone. Just don't. He said, just, you're back from the door, you just speak from the porch there and say you'll come back later, that sort of thing. And I listened to my mentor. And I'm glad that I did. But I've related that, and I've had people snicker at that. I remember one time I mentioned that in another place in North Alabama, and a young lady afterwards said, what did you think? Somebody's going to get you? And so she thought that was just kind of a funny thing. And later on, that very person that thought that was so funny left her husband and 2 boys to marry somebody else. It wasn't all that funny. But I'm just saying, when warnings like that are given, when elders, when teachers, when gospel preachers talk about modesty in behavior, when they appeal to behavior of young people when you're dating, and just say you don't need to be in situations where you are all by yourself a long time, and good people can get into things. Well, all these other weak people, they may need a warning like that, but that'll never happen to me. Oh, so you have an immunization shot. So this is a problem for other people. Oh yeah, not for me. So the wisest man in all the earth fell with that kind of thinking. Do you really think you're wiser than Solomon? I mean, do you really think you can put yourself in a situation that violates biblical principles? Sometimes you say, well, but this is a matter of judgment. Well, okay, if it's a matter of judgment, why do we have to use bad judgment? Why can't we use good judgment if something is a matter of judgment? Then learn to use good judgment. I remember, this is years ago. This is probably out of date. I don't even know. I don't know if at the fairs, do they still have burlesque shows? And if you know that, you're probably afraid to answer anyway, But that used to be something they would have. I don't know if they still do that or not. But anyway, a friend of mine was telling me he went to a burlesque show. He was a Christian, young man. This is years ago. So I said, really, you think you should have done that? And he said, I'm 21 years old. I'm a mature adult. I can do that. Yeah, boy. Right. So what about these strip joints? What about places like that? Oh, yeah. I'm not going to do anything wrong. It doesn't hurt just to look. And so what starts out and seems to be innocent with these text messages, flirtations at the office, and so you hear warnings, oh, don't be silly. Nothing will come of that. Kind of reminds me of a gospel preacher that said there's nothing wrong with adults engaging in mixed swimming. And so he and his wife went swimming with a deacon and his wife. And the preacher that advocated that, this was up in Middle Tennessee or Kentucky, up in that one or the other. Anyway, the preacher that advocated that ended up committing adultery with the deacon's wife. After he's just saying, oh, there's nothing to that. I mean, you can do that, no problem. When you leave the basics in any field, you leave the basics in farming and you pass by, and what do you see? Erosion. Land that's just eroding and won't grow anything after a while. Educators, leave the basics in education. What do you have after a while? People that can't read their diplomas. People that can't add. You can't leave the basics in anything and it work out. And God has given us those lines, those basic guidelines, I'm trying to say, that in Deuteronomy 6, verse 24, he says, are for our good always. Deuteronomy 6:24. Don't be like Harold Comer. Did y'all know Harold Comer? He died recently. He was really a fine gospel preacher. But anyway, there's something funny that happened in his earlier days. He and his wife were vacationing with some good friends and a man and his wife. And so they were at a beach somewhere. And so here's a sign that says, don't proceed any further with vehicle. And so Harold's at the wheel. And his friend said, you see that sign, don't drive any further. And Harold goes, are you kidding? He says, that's just for the tourist. And he drove a little bit further, kaplunk. I mean, all the wheels just sank down right there. And we don't want to do that. This is not just for the tourist. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Tonight, what we learned from Solomon, our takeaway is the fallacy of thinking that you're a super Christian. You're somehow above. Other people may need that, but you're on a different level of maturity. What you're advertising is your spiritual immaturity and your lack of wisdom with that kind of thinking, and it'll lead you to a place you don't want to go. Amen. That's the lesson tonight. If you're here as one who's not yet obeyed the gospel, we encourage you to make your way to the front and let us help you with that. There's nothing more important. And if you've strayed from the Lord, for whatever combination of reasons, come back to him in repentance and prayer, and he will accept you and claim you again as his own. As together we stand and sing.